Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
It's great to be here.
Today we're diving deep into Studies in Business Cycle Theory by Robert E. Lucas Jr.
Oh, a classic.
Yeah, our listeners, they picked this one and it really gets at, one of the most basic questions in macroeconomics.
Right.
Can we explain these booms and busts that economies go through, using just those core ideas of supply and demand?
Yeah, that's really the heart of it, isn't it? It's about, can we use these fundamental principles to understand these really complex movements in the economy?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, when you first hear that, it sounds a little crazy, right? Like, can we really use just supply and demand to explain these sometimes chaotic ups and downs?
Yeah, I mean, even Lucas acknowledges that early on.
Yeah.
There was a lot of skepticism.
Absolutely, and I think rightfully so. But that's what makes this book so interesting. It's an attempt to see just how far we can push this price theoretic approach.
Exactly. The book is a collection of studies where Lucas and his colleagues tried to build these models from the ground up. They look at how prices and wages and even people's expectations about the future all come together to influence employment and ultimately drive these cycles.
So today we're going to trace that journey through the book.
Sounds good.
We'll look at, the hurdles they faced along the way, the insights they uncovered, and the lasting impact their work has had on economics.
It's had a huge impact.
It really has. So as we dig into these studies, there are a few key themes we'll be keeping an eye on.
Okay.
One is this whole idea of the Phillips curve, which suggests there's a relationship between inflation and unemployment,
Right.
and how hard it is to reconcile that with these theoretical models.
Yeah, that was a big challenge for them.
We'll also look at expectations, how people form their beliefs about the future and how those expectations shape the economy. And of course, we can't forget Lucas's famous critique of traditional econometric methods. The idea that you can't just rely on past data to predict the effects of new policies. But let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
What was it that made Lucas and his collaborators believe that a price-theoretic explanation of business cycles was even possible in the first place? I mean, everyone was so skeptical.
Well, I think at their core, they had this deep belief that you could find a coherent explanation for business cycles within the framework of standard price theory. They saw that even in introductory economics, you could talk about fluctuations in employment using supply and demand, even if it was in a really simplified way. And this gave them the idea that the tools were already there.
I see.
It was just a matter of applying them rigorously to the complexities of business cycles.
So it wasn't that they thought it was impossible, it's just that nobody had really done it successfully yet?
Right. They believed the skepticism wasn't because it couldn't be done, but because a complete model hadn't been developed yet.
Interesting. So how did they start building these models? What were some of the first steps they took to sort of break away from the prevailing macroeconomic thinking at the time, especially, in contrast to Keynes' general theory?
One big shift was moving away from this focus on current prices as the main drivers of economic activity.
Okay.
Instead, they often use what's called a two-period model. This might sound simple, but it allowed them to bring in the role of expected future prices.
Ah, I see. So they're saying people aren't just reacting to what things cost today, but also what they think things will cost tomorrow.
Exactly. People's decisions about whether to work today are also influenced by what they think will happen in the future.
That's a big difference from the more backward-looking perspective in a lot of Keynesian models.
It is. Bringing in expectations was a really key move for them.
So within this two-period framework, what were the main things they considered as potential causes of changes in employment levels? Like, besides these shifts in expectations, what else could make people decide to work more or less?
Well, in this competitive framework, they really focused on changes in current prices, current wages, and overall wealth as the main drivers.
Okay.
They specifically decided not to focus on spontaneous changes in people's preferences, because those were seen as more random and harder to model rigorously.
Makes sense.
But then they ran into this issue where it was hard to explain why people would consistently work more during economic booms unless they assumed that leisure was an inferior good.
Oh, an inferior good meaning.
Meaning that as people get wealthier, they actually want less leisure time.
Which doesn't really seem to fit with how people actually behave, does it?
Not really. And that highlighted this difficulty in trying to create a model of labor supply that truly reflected individual choices.
Yeah, that's a great point. You also mentioned this unresolved issue with the Lucas wrapping supply function. Can you explain what that was about?
Yeah, so the Lucas wrapping supply function was this key part of their early models.
Hmm.
It tried to describe how much labor people would supply depending on things like real wages and expected future prices. But the problem was they never really had a solid theoretical justification for the exact form of that function.
So it seemed to work empirically, but they couldn't quite explain why it worked based on a model of individual behavior.
Exactly. And Lucas later admitted that when macroeconomists used this supply function, they were kind of glossing over this deeper issue of microfoundations.
Interesting. And speaking of things that were developing, let's talk about expectations. You mentioned how they initially treated expectations and some of the limitations they ran into. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. So in their earlier work, they often use this idea called adaptive expectations.
Adaptive expectations.
Yeah, it's the idea that people form their expectations about the future by looking at what's happened in the past. Like your expectation for future inflation would be based on how much prices have risen recently.
Okay, that makes sense intuitively. We do tend to look at the past to predict the future.
Right. But the question that came up was whether just having imperfect information, even in a general equilibrium setting, could really explain the full magnitude of these employment fluctuations.
So they're wondering if simply looking backward is enough to explain the ups and downs of the business cycle.
Yeah. And this is where the work of Edmund Phelps comes in. He was really influential in helping them formalize how the economy could operate consistently when individuals have incomplete information. A lot of their discussions revolved around how to achieve this coherence in a general equilibrium setting with information constraints.
This leads us to another really important idea that came out of this research: expectations and the neutrality of money. Can you break down the main idea of this theory and how it challenged the traditional view of the relationship between inflation and unemployment, like the Phillips curve?
Right. So the theory basically says that if individuals are rational in forming their expectations, meaning they use all available information effectively, then predictable changes in the money supply won't really have a lasting effect on things like output and employment. Only unanticipated changes in the money supply would lead to those temporary deviations from the natural rates.
So if the government announces they're going to increase the money supply, everyone adjusts their expectations, and the real economy doesn't really change.
Precisely. And this had huge implications for the Phillips curve, which a lot of people interpreted as showing this stable trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
Right, the idea that you could lower unemployment if you were willing to accept higher inflation.
Exactly. But if Lucas's theory was right, then that relationship might not be so stable after all.
Because if people anticipate the inflation, it won't actually lead to lower unemployment.
Exactly. And it also suggested that the way people were testing the natural rate hypothesis using econometrics was flawed because it didn't account for expectations.
So this challenged the whole foundation of using government policy to fine-tune the economy.
It did. If anticipated inflation wasn't going to lead to lower unemployment, then the justification for a lot of activist monetary and fiscal policies really came into question.
You also mentioned Lucas's paper, Econometric Policy Evaluation, a critique, which is pretty famous. What was the main argument he made in that paper, and why was it so influential?
Well, in that paper, Lucas basically argued that the big econometric models that people were using to forecast the economy weren't really suitable for evaluating policy.
Oh, why not?
Because the structure of the economy, the way people and businesses behave, depends on their expectations about the future.
Right.
And those expectations are likely to change when government policies change.
So a model that's based on past data might not accurately predict what will happen if you introduce whole new policy.
Exactly. People aren't just passive. They try to figure out what the government is going to do and adjust their behavior accordingly.
So you need models that actually take those changes and expectations into account.
Right. Lucas argued that for policy evaluation to be meaningful, you need to model how people change their behavior, not just assume they'll react the same way they did in the past.
So he wasn't saying those econometric models were totally useless, just that they had limitations when it came to predicting the long-term effects of policy changes.
Exactly. This critique really shook things up in macroeconomics.
Now, throughout these studies, Lucas and his colleagues used a bunch of different models to try and understand business cycles. Can you give us a sense of some of the types of models they employed?
Sure. They used a variety of approaches.
Okay.
They started with those simpler frameworks like the two-period model and the Lucas wrapping supply function.
Right.
Those were to incorporate expectations into basic supply and demand. Then they moved on to more complex models with multiple markets and limited information,
Okay.
like the two-market model and later the n-market model, to see how informational problems could lead to those aggregate fluctuations.
Huh.
They also used the overlapping generations model to look at the role of money. And they even explored equilibrium search models to understand unemployment as a rational choice.
Wow. So they really tried to cover all the bases.
They did. Each type of model allowed them to focus on different aspects of the economy and how they might contribute to business cycles.
But one of the challenges they kept running into was trying to reconcile their models with actual real-world data.
Oh yeah, that was a constant struggle.
What were some of the specific issues they had in trying to match the predictions of their models with what they observed empirically?
One problem was trying to explain things like the Phillips curve relationship.
Really?
Their theory suggested that a stable trade-off between inflation and unemployment shouldn't exist in the long run. But that's not always what the data showed.
Right.
Another issue was capturing the persistence of business cycles. Early rational expectations models sometimes implied that the economy would adjust back to equilibrium much faster than it did in reality.
I see. So their models were sometimes too perfect. They didn't always reflect the messiness of the real world.
Right. They also had trouble explaining things like the fact that prices tend to move procyclically, meaning they rise during booms and fall during busts. That wasn't always a straightforward prediction of their models.
So trying to bridge that gap between the microeconomic assumptions and the aggregate data was tricky.
It was. It often required making simplifying assumptions or adding more complexity to their models, like adjustment costs or informational frictions.
The book also gets into the econometric testing of the natural rate hypothesis. What did they conclude about the validity of using those empirical Phillips curves to try to understand the trade-off between inflation and output?
Well, they basically cast a lot of doubt on the idea that you could just look at those historical correlations and use them to guide policy. They argued that those observed relationships were often unstable and that they could break down if policymakers tried to exploit them.
Because people's expectations would change.
Exactly. So their econometric work was all about trying to develop methods that could properly test the natural rate hypothesis while accounting for those expectations.
So they were saying a stable, exploitable, long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment probably doesn't exist if people are forming their expectations rationally.
Right.
Now, one theme that keeps popping up in these studies is the role of information,
Yeah, definitely.
especially limited or imperfect information. How do they explore the impact of these informational constraints on the economy?
Well, they often used models with multiple markets where people could only see the prices in their own local market.
Okay.
So they had to try and figure out whether a change in price was due to something happening in their specific market or something happening to the overall economy.
Ah, so it's like trying to separate the signal from the noise.
Exactly. And that imperfect information could lead to people making decisions that weren't quite optimal, which could then ripple through the economy and create fluctuations.
So even if everyone's acting rationally based on the information they have, these limitations can still create those business cycle dynamics.
Yeah.
Another thing they emphasize is the importance of microfoundations. Why was it so important for them to build macroeconomic models based on individual decision-making?
They believed that good macroeconomic theory had to be grounded in how individual households and firms actually behave. They saw this microfoundations approach as crucial for a few reasons. First, it just makes the models more rigorous and internally consistent.
Okay.
You're not just making arbitrary assumptions about aggregate relationships.
Right.
Second, it helps you understand how the economy actually works at a deeper level.
I see.
And third, and maybe most importantly for policy, it makes the models more reliable for predicting how people will respond to changes in policy.
Because you're actually modeling their decision-making process.
Exactly.
Now, this collection covers a pretty significant period of Lucas's work. Did his thinking about business cycles change over time?
Oh, absolutely. You can see a clear evolution.
In what ways?
Well, early on, he focused a lot on incorporating expectations into those more standard macroeconomic models, often using adaptive expectations.
Okay.
But over time, he really shifted towards this idea of rational expectations and building those more explicitly micro-founded general equilibrium models.
I see.
The role of limited information became really central. And he also became much more critical of those traditional econometric methods for policy evaluation. He argued that you needed models that could actually capture how policies influence expectations and behavior.
So he wasn't just trying to tweak existing frameworks, he was trying to create something entirely new.
Right. based on these more fundamental ideas about rational choice and how markets work.
So looking back at studies in business cycle theory as a whole, what would you say are one or two of the most significant and lasting contributions of this work?
Hmm, that's a tough one. But I'd say two of the biggest are the introduction of rational expectations into macroeconomic modeling and the critique of econometric policy evaluation.
Those are definitely big ones.
Yeah, the idea that people form their expectations in this forward-looking and model-consistent way really revolutionized macroeconomics.
It changed how people build models.
It did. And the Lucas critique forced economists to rethink how they were evaluating policy.
And it led to the development of new methods.
Exactly. Those two ideas have had a huge impact on both theoretical and applied macroeconomics.
So for you, the learner, what are some of the key takeaways from this deep dive into Lucas's work?
Well, I hope you've gained a deeper appreciation for the effort to build a rigorous understanding of business cycles, starting with basic economic principles.
Hmm.
And a key part of that is understanding how our expectations about the future really shape our economic decisions. You've also seen how difficult it is to predict the effects of government policies based on past data because people's behavior is likely to change when the rules change.
Right.
And hopefully you now have a better understanding of how limited information and the way we process that information can contribute to these fluctuations in the economy.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. Given all the complexity we've talked about in understanding how expectations and information influence our behavior, and the inherent difficulty in predicting the effects of policy, it makes you wonder, how much faith should we really have in policymakers' ability to actively manage the economy?
That's a great question.
Does this work suggest that maybe a more rules-based approach, like some have advocated, might be a better strategy?
Interesting.
Acknowledging that we have these limitations in our ability to predict the future and fine-tune this complex system, Robert Lucas Jr.'s studies in business cycle theory certainly gives us a lot to think about.